tonight our guest is Scott Kreins, who many of you may know is the chairman of Juniper Networks. He's had an extraordinary, illustrious business career, and he is now, in addition to remaining the chairman, he's started a foundation called 1440 Foundation, which we'll talk about. And really, I think the core of that, if you will, is relationships, awareness about your lives, compassion, and we're just going to have a conversation about that. So welcome, Scott. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you guys for coming.
We did talk about your business career, and actually it's interesting, Dan Martin, who I don't think you've met, who's sitting over there.
Hey, Dan.
Dan is from Cal State East Bay, and I understand you're an alumnus. Yes, and Dan actually is a visiting scholar with us working on a mentoring program, actually how being compassionate as a mentor very positively affects people's lives. But maybe you can tell us actually how from Cal State East Bay your career has the trajectory of that, and in some ways with what you're doing now, especially in regard to 1440 Foundation, how were you always sort of interested in this? Did you see this in the future, or have your views, values evolved, changed, or have you had some incredible insights based on these experiences?
Well, that's a lot of questions. I don't.
And you have 1 minute.
Yeah, hurry up. Well, first of all, I mean, Dan, congratulations on officially being at Stanford. This is the only way I could get in. Stop by for an hour. Well, you know, it's first of all, thank you guys all for coming. It's cool that this many people would show up and want to talk about this, first of all, and have interest. And I'm really interested to know what you all think too. The kind of condensed version for me of my story about entering into greater interest actually started abruptly, frankly, in 2004. In January of 2004, my dad passed, and I was 45 then, and it was really jarring. It was like mortality became real for the first time. You know, I had lost grandparents, and fortunately not friends or siblings or other parents, but it was that day in particular, the thing that was so unanswerable was what matters. And to make the long story shorter, most of the stuff that I thought used to no longer did. And I went through this kind of very long, windy road and had to finally stare at the fact that I wasn't who I wished I was, and who I was trying really hard to have everyone else think that I was. And so, you know, it's kind of, so, you know, nothing matters and you're a fake is a startling thing. And as I kind of tried to figure all that out, I still had responsibilities and things to do, and I kind of put it off for a few years and pretended like that wasn't happening. And at the same time, in the work world at Juniper, it was growing and there was lots of stuff to do. And the thing that kind of brought them together for me it was a couple things. One, practice. I began a practice of my own, a sitting meditation, mindfulness practice. But also at work, the company had gotten big enough that there wasn't really that much I could do with my own two hands anymore. You know, it was a couple thousand people and a couple $1 billion, and we were doing business all over the world. And, you know, what am I going to do as one person? And if I could walk into a product meeting and make a better decision than the people doing it all day, every day, the assignment wouldn't be to keep doing that. It would be to figure out why I could drop by not being any smarter than anyone else and make a better decision than the people who are working on it all day long. So either I was wrong about my insight, or there was something that needed to change, because people working on something all the time should be better at somebody that drops by. So the thing that I decided that I could do with my own two hands that would have most leverage was helping to contribute to developing people. And in the kind of the corporate world, that translates in a way into leadership development. And that was my sort of simple understanding of it at the start. And so I launched into trying to figure that out without really having a lot of experience in it. And what I came to believe, and had a lot of help in learning about this, was that nobody really, if your goal is to be a leader, for whatever that means, nobody cares what you say until they know who you are. You know, no one cares what you know until they know that you care. I think I don't even know who said that. I keep quoting that. Somebody did, because it's too clever to be made up. And it wasn't me. But so the way that became a thing to pursue was this notion of authentic leadership. And Bill George out of Harvard and others have written about this and labeled it exactly that. So this notion of authenticity, you have to show up as who you really are, because people can tell. You know, I don't know how many Malcolm Gladwell fans there are, but you know, if you've read his book Blink, he has this thing called a thin slice. And he uses an example in there about a counterfeit piece of art as a statue. But anyway, we all do this thing, sometimes not even consciously, that he calls a thin slice, which is, and my way of thinking about that in the context of what we were trying to do is this person authentic? And that isn't necessarily the way it gets said, but the way that it translates, and what does that mean, is when you hear, you sort of, whenever we come across somebody, we are, consciously or not, we're asking, is that person telling me something that they believe, which would be the authentic version, or are they telling me something that they want me to believe? And that would be the inauthentic version. And it's subtle because they're not lying, or they're not making something up. They may very well believe it too. But if their intention when you engage is to try and make you believe something, and you don't know what they believe, you know, we lean back from that. And instead, if somebody's just saying, this is what I believe, and I don't know, and I'm not here to make anybody believe anything, this is what I believe, I think we lean into that. And so that's my definition of authenticity. Well, the more I tried to learn, the more I came to realize that a step precedes that, which is self-awareness. Because it's not really possible to show up and represent who I am if I don't know. And so one of my favorite interview questions, and one of the conversations we had a lot in the circles that we held doing a lot of these sessions, was, who are you? And a lot of times I'd just say that, who are you? And I wouldn't add any words, just stop, listen. And if somebody, you know, a lot of times people would say, well, I'm an engineer, or I'm a father, or whatever. And I'd say, well, okay, that's what you do. So I get that. But underneath that, who are you? And I didn't have an answer to that. So this notion of self-awareness preceded being able to show up authentically. And then I have a lot more I could ramble on about then, therefore, what. But for me, the path into self-awareness and ultimately compassion, which I know we'll talk about and I'll hold, came to this path of being jarred, trying to figure out what to do that mattered, trying to figure out that's what mattered, and then ending up on this journey that of two regards. One, this leadership thing had to start with being self-aware in order to show up authentically. And what matters has, in my opinion, has to start in here. If I don't, I mean, it's gotta come from here. And most of what I was doing was kind of outward in. If I do this, people will think that. And maybe it'll even be true. Who knows? If enough people think it, maybe I'll believe it. But that's not really, and all this stuff in here, that's complicated. I don't know the answer to that, but I know that I need a job and a house, and I want to have a family, and so I'll do all this other stuff. But that's not really staring at, in my view, the most important questions and the place that it starts, which is, inside out, for lack of a better way to say it. And I'm not here with any answers either. But it's a long answer to probably half of one of your questions, but that's...
You're the only person here who didn't have the answer so far.
Yeah. Can't wait for the Q&A. So.
Well, getting back to this self-awareness, which I think it's interesting because so many people have this tendency because their view of themselves in some ways is a construction of what they want other people to think of them. It's not who they really are deep down inside. Was it mindfulness that brought the self-awareness? I mean, obviously, just based on the tone and your comments, clearly this has been a process, and it's one which you've taken very seriously and very deeply. Was that path manifested through this practice? Did that bring you to that point by those types of insights? Was it meeting people, trying to understand? Was it reading?
It was out of desperation, I think, really. I started reading a lot of stuff because after, this in this What Matters quest, I don't know if you've found this in lots of books, and it's not really the fault of any author, but I read all these books on inner journey and lots of other things and mindfulness and so forth, and be with what is and stuff. And you start out at the beginning of them and you're like, wow, that describes exactly the thing that I'm wrestling with. This is great. And then, of course, the rest of the book fades away and it doesn't really present much more than an eloquent description of the same challenge we could all articulate. So I read lots of books and didn't, of course, I'm not sure what I thought I'd find, I guess, but whatever it wasn't as simple as reading up on it. And then I met this guy, his name's Foral, and he's a Western born. He was born in Maine, and he's a monk. And he went and studied in Japan and China. And so I've been practicing. He still lives in Vermont now, so he went to China and Japan and then came back here. And so he's been a teacher, and then I've just sat a lot on my own. And I think that what I've come to accept is that we don't so much arrive at epiphanies per se, or at least I haven't. I guess I'd say that. I don't know. I think you said Eckhart Tolle was in here, and of course I read his Now and all that stuff, and he talked about it happening on a park bench one morning or night, I think, and having an insight. So certainly everybody, we all have our own way. For me, I have not discovered it to be a thing that happened on a day. I think that's why it's called practice. It's just practice. And I find clarity at times, real clarity that I've not been familiar with before. That's what Foral talks about: clarity, concentration, equanimity. Those are the three aspirations, not necessarily in any particular order. So I don't know. To answer your question, I guess, or best I can, it didn't provide, quote answers. It provides kind of comfort and structure and pause and stillness and inquiry. And then I just go out and do whatever I was going to do anyway, I guess. But with more awareness, and it's sometimes more clarity. I can think more clearly. I can allow, maybe that's the equanimity. I allow things to be what they are. And it's, somebody said, there's a difference between sadness and suffering. Suffering is wishing reality was different than it was, and that's actually optional. And sadness is simply that, being sad about what is. And I used to not like to be sad. So I would just, whenever that emotion came up, I'd put it in a box and try and forget about it as quickly as possible and make sure that that didn't hurt me, because I didn't want anything to hurt me that I couldn't control. And now I have a lot more room for sadness. I'm still sad about my dad all the time. I had a really close experience with a friend the other day who had just lost her father, and it brings all that right back. And I actually embraced that. I think but that's different than suffering with wishing it was different. So I don't know. I just find lots of things come from practice of inquiry and stillness and so forth in different ways.
When you talked about this journey, and you mentioned your own experience at Juniper in regard to, what is it that I can contribute in development of leadership, and how has that impacted what you do there? Or do you feel that while you have yourself been on this journey, which obviously has given you some incredible insights, have you been able to transmit that in a sense where when you have these interactions compared, let's say, to before, how is the interaction different? How is the response different? How does that determine, if you will, how a person proceeds who, let's say, if you're coaching or mentoring or something, versus perhaps prior to this? What's different?
I guess I'd say in the work around the teaching, and I have to call it teaching. It's just sharing in the exploration, really. Its manifestations have as much to do with how it affects people elsewhere and otherwise in their lives as it does in the leadership roles. There's some specific things that we would do in the work around leadership development, but the trainings, a lot of times it was just we do it for 2 or 3 days, and it'd just be in circle. We'd start out with circle, talk about circle. Happens to be, I think, really a powerful thing. And I found when we did it, the first one, we had all this material, and nobody wanted to sit in circle, and what's that about, and I'm here to work, and what are these people going to think, and all that stuff. And by the time you get to the second day, that's all anybody wants to do. And by the time, having done 2 or 3 of the sessions, most of the material just kind of got thrown out, because it wasn't about telling anybody anything. It was about people. There were facilitated things that happened and so forth, but it was more just about people being willing to be vulnerable. And the dynamic that made it kind of a unique opportunity in the business setting was because I was the CEO, and I would sit there and start. We do this exercise. I don't know if you've ever done it. It's called a lifeline. So lifeline is like you take a table of contents of your life. Just what would your chapter headings be? And we'd say do 2. Do one that you're willing to share, and if you're hesitant, do another one just for yourself that you don't have to share. And people, and usually what happens, and certainly when I did it, people do it, you start out and you say, well, let's see, there was when I graduated from college and I got married, or I got my first job or whatever, and then you go, well, those are the things that happened, but are those really the chapter headlines? And it's my first heartbreak, or when something happened in my life and what have you. And so I'd stand up and do mine first. And I talked about sitting outside to tempo music on the curb as a kid after a music lesson when my mom was an hour late, and being embarrassed at all the people that would come by and ask if I needed a ride, because it must be that nobody cared to come and pick me up. And she did come eventually, and there was no trauma about that necessarily, but on one hand there was. And a lot of my life was actually below the line. You draw kind of a line through this, and you say, well, here's status quo, or whatever, neutral. And so is that a happy time, or it's a sad time? And then what made it that way? And most of my life was actually below the line stuff. And most of my energy was spent trying to not have bad things happen, which is not a recommended way. But anyway, I talked about all that stuff. And then what it created as a dynamic was everyone, it felt, well, if he can do it, then it must be okay for me. And what would happen is people would toss out that lifeline that they did, the censored version or the filtered one. All anybody wanted to do was talk about their own in whatever detail. And we didn't ask other people to stand up in front of everybody. We'd have people break off and do it in pairs and just talk to each other. And people went from making two so they didn't have to share the secret things to then saying, well, how come I don't get to stand up and say mine to everybody? And what you ended up coming out of with that, which was there's kind of the 4 steps that I still think this is true for lots of things, but if you start by being self-aware and you show up authentically, you get the opportunity to participate in a relationship of trust, and that gives you the invitation to inspire. So self-awareness, authenticity, trust, and inspiration. And leadership is about, in my view, is about participating in inspiration. And that's only going to happen if it's preceded by those things. And so what we developed were a whole lot of really deeply trusted relationships. And people that spent this time in circle with one another could then pick up the phone from wherever in the world they happen to be and talk to one of their circle mates and say, I'm really struggling with this and I need your help. Or I got a great idea, what do you think? And another person would feel free to say, I don't think that's a great idea. And nobody's feelings were hurt and everybody felt it was safe. All you're really doing is making a safe place. Now, is that a good thing for work? I think so. I can talk about why. I mean, we talk about a lot of stuff, high quality relationships and agreements and results and so forth. We've formalized, it's not a word, but we made formulaic a lot of this in ways. If you start by having a high quality relationship with someone, then you can make a high quality agreement that's much simpler. And if you do that, it's much easier to get high quality results. If you skip over the relationship part and the trust and you try to make a high quality agreement, what's it going to be? It's going to be really long, really complicated, and it's going to try to legislate trust, which means the results are going to suffer terribly. And then you're going to go, gosh, we need a better agreement, and come back and work even harder on an even more complex agreement. Whereas if you start out and build trust, then the agreement's simpler and the results are easier to come by, which is kind of all the way back to what for all would say you really ought to be in search of, which is clarity. So I think it's all related.
Well, it's interesting, though, you talk about this vulnerability because until you, I think that's what so many of us hide from, and I think in some extent what you were saying, which is you were saying you're living down here. The reality is a lot of people live down here, and they don't want to face that they're living down here because they want to think they're up here, and they spend an immense amount of energy projecting that they're up here, which I think costs an immense amount of psychic energy to maintain that. And what's amazing, and I think you've experienced this, and I have myself, is when you get up in front of a group and number one, admit you're a fragile, frail human being who isn't perfect, and you've had painful experiences that hurt you. Almost invariably, everybody sits there and says, that's me too. And, they want to embrace you. And once you get that embracing, that's where this relationship and trust, because once somebody has seen you vulnerable, they know you're like them and they can care about you, versus relationships where you're sitting there going, what does he really want from me, or she? What's going on there? What's the subtext? How do I respond to that? I don't know. And it's like you said, then once you have that, you have to sit there and have all these very complex responses to these types of interactions, where really it is about being okay with your own vulnerability and then being able to share that.
Yeah, and you have to be, one of the simplest analogy for it that I always used and still think is the same thing you're saying, really, but it's kind of if you remember that's funny because my son's about to go to the Sadie Hawkins dance, or pick any high school dance. The girls are on one side and the boys are on the other, and nobody wants to walk across. And so somebody, we talk about this in the context of leadership, somebody needs to be first to offer, and it's going to have to be the leader. If you're in a work setting, it's not likely to be the junior person. If you're in some pretense of hierarchy, then you're going to have to go first. But whoever does, somebody has to be first to offer, and that means walking all the way across the dance floor and having all the kids watch and see whether you get rejected on the other side or not. But of course you don't. And then what happens 5 minutes later? Of course, the dance floor is full, right? Because everybody wants to dance. And I think, this will actually make our way around to compassion. It's because compassion is in my opinion, compassion is a natural instinct. So I think it's not a matter of learning it or developing it or whatever. It's just a matter of allowing it because it's there, in my view. And the reason I think that is because, and this is a secular comment because I don't, the teacher I mentioned is trained in Buddhism. I'm not, and it's so it's just a belief. To call it noetic, just something you think inside of yourself must be true. I think that we all share a common source and a common origin. I don't have I don't map that into particular traditions. I just think at some level, on our way to being here in this room together, there's an origin that we share as one. And hopefully it's what we're going to go back to. We'll find out. So when you think about compassion, I have compassion for myself. I don't hurt myself. I care about me, and that's sort of imprinted in our survival instinct and our DNA and so forth, to care and to embrace and to help and and support and to respond if we feel trust and empathy and so forth. And why is that? It's because it's natural. Me caring for you is no different than me caring for me. It's just been distanced from us by this need to survive and by broken trust and by, at some level, necessity in nature. If you trust the wrong animal and they kill you, that's bad. So, some of that's maybe outdated survival need. But at some sort of really base level, compassion is just as natural as it extends to all of us as it is for me to care about not hurting myself, or about wanting the best, or about wanting to embrace or look out for. And sometimes it's easier to care for somebody else than it is for yourself. So it's I just think it's a perfectly natural thing. It just gets, so convoluted, and we get so distanced from it and so protective that we, hide it. But it doesn't need to be taught. It just needs to be allowed, I think.
I think you're right. It's interesting because, as you probably have seen examples of, there will be people who work for years side by side, but they really never even know anything about each other, which is extraordinary. And it's because of this sort of protective barrier, and in some ways people thinking that they're going to somehow be judged, or if they show their vulnerability, and it'll have a negative impact. And I think that really is the challenge. It's extraordinary. Surveys have been done that have shown that 1 in 4 people feel that they have nobody to talk to, or in the United States, when they're in pain, when they're suffering, 1 in 4, they have nobody they feel they can go to. And it's interesting because we look at third world countries where we have all these people desiring to come to the United States for what they think is something of value. And oftentimes they think having a higher standard of living or engaging in consumer culture gives them something. And and what's extraordinary is they come to a society where we have an epidemic of isolation, loneliness, and depression. Yet, if you look at their cultures, many of the ones they come from where some of the greatest insights and wisdom traditions arise. And it's really an extraordinary paradox. And it gets back to this thing. In some ways, what you're talking about is this caring instinct. It's a manifestation of community. When you have a community, and within that community is developed oftentimes to protect yourself, but within that community, number one, people see you for who you are, because it's usually so small you can't hide. And when you can't hide, you don't make an effort to hide. But people then can respond to you authentically because they know you're suffering. And the other side is you also have responsibilities to that community because you don't want to let it down, and potentially because it puts the community at risk. And I think this gets very much to the creation of these relationships or bonds of trust, because that's really necessary for compassion to manifest itself. And that's the exact, I think, what you said, where once you have community, once you have relationship, once you have the sense of trust, then you can call up, and no matter what the issue is, you can sit there and authentically describe it and not be offended by the response, because you know that the person is responding to you because they care, not because there's necessarily an agenda.
And there are so many, it reminds me of the two things I would say about, actually I'll say three things. One, we had an opportunity a couple years ago to spend some time in Africa, and some of in some very difficult conditions, and you see some of the biggest, brightest smiles there. On a per capita basis, it must be some number greater than this. But two things about these Native American things, culture, traditions, and culture about. One is one of the greetings. I don't know the tribe, but one of their greetings is not hello or how are you or whatever. It's I see you. What a cool thing. Huh? And another one is that they have they also do this in tribe and circle, I guess you could say. If as a kid becomes a teenager, or it doesn't have to be a teenager, but maybe when it happens, and they go off the rails somehow, whatever that might mean, they get together and they put the person in the center, and the people surrounding them share all of their hopes and dreams and beliefs about that person who's struggling. They don't beat them up. They don't, make it more difficult or judge or anything. You just tell them all the belief and support and love and trust and hopes and dreams that they have for them. And that's how the culture works. We don't, I don't know who we is, but in other parts of the world, let's say, and certainly in quote West, it's not so easy to find that as readily. First of all, tribe is a difficult concept to identify. Community, we think of, and that exists more or less in different places, but it's certainly not as reliable a support as it is in some other cultures. And I think to the great detriment.
No, I think you're right. It's interesting because I think that's one of the problems. You look in some of the cultures where you were just mentioning, in very close proximity are the parents, the grandparents, the relatives, people who've been for generations together, which defines that community. And in our transient society, you may not live anywhere near anybody who you've grown up with, cared for, been with. And I think that's part of the challenge.
Yeah, and as I age, I'm noticing respect for elders is harder to come by than it is in some of these other cultures. Yeah. What do you know is a more common answer.
Maybe I can get your thoughts on, we're talking about community. One of the challenges, though, I think, and one of the things that I think puts our humanity at risk is actually, as we evolved, you can look at 5,000 years ago, that's when cities started happening. 10,000 years ago, the primary survival strategy was hunter-gatherers and 10 to 50 people. And studies have shown that there's a tendency, which probably has a genetic component, which allows us to have this compassion and engagement based on certain criteria, which you can define as your community. But once you define that, what can happen is then you say, there's my community, and then everyone's outside of my community and are potentially putting me at risk. And maybe it's because you don't have a trust relationship. But if we're going to solve the problems that are facing our world, do you have thoughts on how we can expand, if you will, our compassion or our caring that extends far beyond ourselves?
Yeah, I have a pet peeve sometimes around these kinds of conversations. People don't ask the question you're asking. It's easy. In fact, I saw this at a gathering recently. It's easy to stand up and say, this is bad, and things need to change, and if something better doesn't happen, we're all doomed, and okay, it's not wrong. It's just not that helpful. And in fact, a lot of times when we have these conversations, not we, but when the conversation comes up about what's possible, sometimes it seems like the author or the speaker or whomever has to start with a litany of why things are so bad and why it needs to change. And then you're supposed to be inspired. You're like, well, we're all doomed and nobody cares, and we're going to die if this doesn't get different. And so, you ready to change? And it's like, no, I'm just going to give up now. So I really, and this is one of the things about 1440 that we have a sort of the highest order thing that we believe or that we aspire to see in the world. This is 5 words: compassionate communities leading generative lives. That's our thing that we hope for. And actually the thing that sits above that, I mentioned already, is this belief that we share common origin, so compassion is a natural instinct. And then if we can take compassion and build community, then that's a good thing. And then we want to be leading these generative lives, meaning trying to set example or being that. And the notion of a generative life is a life that creates more energy than it consumes. And if you've ever, we've all been around like projects or settings where you can work really hard on something, but you're really energized by it, and you work 15 hours, you can get up the next day, and you can't wait to get there again, and you think about it at night. And so that's generative. And toxic, you could work 2 hours on something that you really hate, and you're drained and exhausted, and you drag yourself out of bed to get there the next day. That's toxic. So compassionate communities leading generative lives. How do you do that? Well, so you kind of just keep peeling the onion, and we believe that happens by developing the whole person through the practice of authentic relationship, which I talked a little bit about what that means in a corporate setting around leadership, but just authentic relationship and how do you do that? You invite people to experiential learning around awareness and relationship. It's not rocket science. Being skilled at being authentic is a choice that we can make, and being self-aware and so forth in whatever means that can happen. It can be prayer and Christianity, it can be Buddhism, it can be yoga, it could just be sitting by oneself. It doesn't have to have anybody telling anybody else anything. But just making the commitment to show up as we really are and let go of outcomes is a good first step. And then this practice of relationship as a skill, as a life skill. That's the thing that 1440 is about. It's a teachable thing.
Scott, maybe you can. Maybe not everyone is aware of 1440. I was going to get to that, but you've sort of brought it up. Maybe you can just tell people what that is and what it means and how it evolved.
Well, it came out of what I was mentioning was the leadership work and this notion of authenticity and authentic relationship and so forth as a leadership technique, I guess you'd call it. And it just became so compelling to me and so important that it became necessary to spend more time practicing it on a broader front and trying to make it not just part of a way to build a leader, but we talk about it, authentic relationship in education, wellness, and the workplace. And so that led to thinking about what kind of foundation we could start and what we could do and how to put our efforts and energies and so forth to work. 1440, the name came from my wife, Joanie, which is, she was sitting one day having a really wonderful moment in her garden, and she wondered how many of those there are. And in a day, there's 1,440 minutes. So 1440 is about the pursuit of being fully present and aware of every one of them. least that we're awake for. So authentic relationship and the practice of relationship as a life skill is not any different than what I was talking about. It's practicing things like dialogue. And dialogue, for some may have studied and know a lot about it. I'm a student of it. I'm not an expert in it, but it's very different than discussion, and it's very different than debate, and there's an opportunity to invite people into those. Dialogue is listening for understanding. It comes from the Greek root is dialogos, which is through meaning. And so developing the understanding through meaning. I'm not listening because I'm trying to tell you anything, or all I'm trying to do is listen for understanding. I just grasp meaning. And nothing is more, in my opinion, nothing is more appreciated in a relationship than for the person you're in relationship with to be trying really hard to understand you. So that's a really great way to walk across the dance floor and invite somebody into relationship. It's a really great thing to do with yourself. So relationship can be had with self, it can be had with family, it can be had with others, it can be had with community, it can be had with world, it can be had with nature. And it is all of those things. But being a real student and a craftsperson and a committed practitioner of relationship as a practice. It's very cool to be sitting here in relationship with you. I really want to make sure we save time to have that make its way back to me. It's generative. It creates more energy than it consumes. And in my view, if you took that and what 1440 tries to support happening is the relationship skills that are practiced between a student and a teacher. If you think about the most powerful classroom experiences, whether you're here at Stanford or that you've had in your lives otherwise, chances are high that the most impactful and most memorable of those are attached to a time when you had a relationship with the teacher. That the teacher that shared themselves in some way and that you connected with, however that happened, probably created a pretty powerful education experience. So it's odd to me that we spend billions of dollars trying to shrink classrooms and add computers and all this stuff, and we spend no time teaching teachers how to have relationship with students. Now, fortunately, lots of teachers come to know that anyway, or come across it, or are very passionate and are very committed, and so not at all being critical. But if we spent some time teaching teachers how to walk across the dance floor and invite students to be equal members in a relationship and to really listen, I think we could make much better use of the rest of the $1 billion or billions of dollars if we just spent a fraction of 1% of that on relationship skills in the classroom. I'm sitting next to a brain surgeon here, so you are going to know this much better than I, but the most healing experiences that happen in medicine happen in relationship. Obviously, we need experts and skilled practitioners, especially if they're working on your brain, I guess. It'd be a really good thing. But an awful lot of the healing that happens is a function of trust and faith and belief. And I've talked about it in the workplace. So, and it's obviously true. People that my belief is people that do arrive at deep understanding of relationship and authenticity and so forth on their own, that's come from some community that occurred in their lives. It could be a church. It could be just a very close family. It could be a mentoring relationship. I don't know. But some community held them in some way that gave them some support, sadly or not. Or to a little degree, or to a great degree. So I think that as we do that, we just multiply the impact of it. People walking around as more mindful, if you will, or aware practitioners of relationship are going to spread that. And I think that it's going to, for at least as near as we can figure out in 1440 and what we can do, it will matter more than anything else I can think of to do. there's plenty of great causes and lots of great philanthropic efforts underway, curing lots of life's ills, but that's the one that we think that we can make the most impact by trying to stimulate or support. We call it serving champions. There's lots of champions that do this, and most of what we do is just serve the people that are already doing it.
Just to make a couple comments. One is in regard to medicine. It's interesting because people perceive neurosurgery and perhaps heart surgery as sort of the pinnacle of medicine. And oftentimes, though, in that conversation, the parts that you were just talking about, which frankly are the most important parts, are the connection and the human touch. And sorry for my runny nose and cough intermittently. Trying to recover from a virus. But it's interesting because sometimes that's put over here. And, I recently gave a talk at one of the medical schools to the incoming students. And I was saying, science and technology are wonderful and have resulted in extraordinary cures, have saved millions of lives, but all the science and technology in the world is not going to do anything for a child who is crying and needs to be hugged. It's not going to do anything for a person who's dying and needs you to hold their head. And the mistake is somehow thinking that it's all about the science and technology, because frankly, I will tell you in my own practice as a neurosurgeon that the other component is equally actually as important. Getting back to just making one more comment about the power, and a lot of us I don't think appreciate when you're talking about a teacher reaching out to a student or somebody who reaches out to a child who is suffering or in need. The power of that interaction is extraordinary. And the thing is, it gets back to the suffering issue. When a person reaches out and sees somebody suffering and authentically connects to them to help them, it can have extraordinary power in regard to actually that person's life and their future. And you should not ever dismiss that. That is an extraordinary power that I think each of us has. We just don't know it sometimes. And we don't know how, when we have that one interaction, it can actually have this huge impact in somebody's trajectory in their life.
And it's, as it turns out, the first thing we did in 1440 was try and figure out who's already doing stuff like this, so that we had really, I think, a great piece of advice early on from people that were well practiced in foundation work and philanthropy for their own purposes, not necessarily for this. And they said, well, the first thing you should do before you charge in there as if you had some insight somebody doesn't already have is figure out what everybody else is already doing. And what we found out, there's a whole field called social and emotional learning, or SEL. I don't know if you had reason to know about it, but we didn't. So it turns out it's built on these pillars. It's self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, and responsible decision-making, and relationship skills are the 5 things. And it actually teaches this. So it teaches kids about self-awareness and about social awareness and about making responsible decisions and about self-regulation. And there's all these, and it's mandatory in Illinois. It's been taught to about 4 million kids. There are practitioners of it all across the country and in some cases around the world. Some of it's taught very experientially. Goldie Hawn, if you remember and know her, has a program called Mind Up, which is built on understanding neuroscience, and it's taught to kindergartners. And kindergartners through 5th grade and 8th grade, who are taught about the prefrontal cortex and the difference between that and the amygdala, and what it means to pause and give your prefrontal cortex a chance to make an executive decision instead of having your amygdala make a reactive survival-based decision. And they have little pictures of the brains, and they talk about in their hands how the PFC's up here and the amygdala's in here, and they'll walk. Kids, kindergartners, 1st graders walk around saying, "Are you using your PFC?" And then they go home, and their parents are complaining about something, they'll say, Mom, you need a brain break. Because they do that in Mind Up programs. They take brain breaks. They pause. I went to a high school. I went to a middle school and a high school at a place called Visitation Valley, which is up in San Francisco. It's actually, I wasn't really aware of how bad a district it was in terms of violence. In the last few years, I think it's 3, there had been 41 murders within 8 blocks of these schools. The kids there for several years have been practicing meditation, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. They have 15 minutes in the morning called quiet time and 15 minutes at the end of the day. And the people that are running it keep very detailed statistics of before, after, and so forth. And when they started the program at Visitation Valley, I think 5 years ago, and 19 of the 37 teachers per year were leaving. So they had more than 50% teacher turnover. Now they have a waiting list to get into the school, and they have 0 turnover. And truancies and suspensions and things that they can measure are down 70 and 80%. We went in the 6th grade class and we just sat with them. And the teacher rings the bell, and for 15 minutes these 6th graders go dead silent. You don't have to meditate. You don't have to. It's a transcendental technique that they're taught if they choose to, but they don't have to. They just have to sit and be quiet. And they do that willingly. Then we went to the high school, and they had one of the principal there told us about they had an auditorium full of, I think it was 350 kids or 400 kids. And shoot, I can't remember his name. This was supported originally by a guy named David Lynch and David Lynch Foundation. David Lynch is a big-time producer guy. I don't really, if I knew more, I could remember
Was it Blue Velvet? Yeah.
Yeah, what's the guy's name? He's well, anyway, maybe I'll remember it. He comes into the auditorium, and he's kind of a high-energy guy, and he's making all this noise, and all the kids see him, they all get carried away. He comes to the front of the place. There's 400 kids in this auditorium. They ring the bell, bang. 400 kids in the auditorium go silent, sit still for 15 minutes. Teenage high school kids. Same statistics at the school: violence, suspensions, truancies, absences, and grades are better. In the SEL work, they've done a macro study of 700 micro studies of these SEL programs, and the test results compared to test groups that haven't been exposed to the social emotional training, the test results are 11 percentage points higher, 11 to 17 actually, but 11 is the lowest, in the groups that have had the social and emotional training. So there's enormous amounts of very hard data around just being still, just pausing and being silent. And then there's incredible convergence of the understanding of the brain. But anyway, here comes all this neuroscience talking about the brain and how it's working, and fMRI studies of different regions of the brain that are active at different times. And there's probably many people you've seen had come in here, and I understand Roshi Joan was in not long ago, and guys like Dan Siegel that are studying interpersonal neurobiology. And so there's science converging along with evidence proofs and empirical data and long-running studies of mindfulness practices. And I don't know where you want to label compassion and all that, but if kids self-regulate and make a choice to go out that door instead of into the playground because they know they'll get in a fight if they go there, and they know they'll feel bad if they do that, and they'd rather not, but they don't want to look bad in front of their friends, but if they take the side door, they'll just miss the confrontation altogether, and when they get home, they'll feel better. It's not, is that compassion? I don't know. I think it is. It's compassion for yourself, at least, just in making the choice not to put yourself in that position. So there's an enormous amount of activity going on around this space that what we're trying to do is figure out how to create leverage that allows it to be shared more widely. If you're interested, we just made an investment in a company called Headspace. So if you look at headspace.com, you'll be invited to a meditation session with Andy Puddicombe. Tremendously successful thing that they've launched. They've installed this mindfulness training if you happen to fly Virgin Atlantic across the ocean, it'll be on the backs. It'll be in the video on the back of every seat in every airplane, and you can have a guided meditation about relaxing and sleeping and distraction. And they sold it to Goldman Sachs because they think bankers that can be more aware and can be more present will make better decisions. They installed it at Selfridges, which is the biggest department store in the UK. It's in every Selfridges store. You can go into the cosmetics department, sit down in a little pod and get a meditation about self-image, kind of check in about whether you really need all that stuff in the cosmetics department or not. So there's a bunch of cool stuff making its way into the world in integrated ways, whether it's in department stores or airplanes or classrooms. There's a huge field of mind-body stress reduction that's been making its way into the medical practice that John Kabat-Zinn started many, many years ago, 25 or 30 years ago. I think you said he was in recently. So all we're trying to do is figure out how do we put an amplifier on all of this? How do we make this more visible to more people, to extend wider invitations in ways that scale, that have leverage, that will invite people to participate with people? Because it will reach a tipping point. And when it does, I'll tell you an interesting thing about tipping points, and then I'll shut up here. This is a communications point to do with the way networking stuff works, but you can go all the way back to the telegraph, or the radio, or the telephone, or faxes, or emails. Maybe it's come during some of the lifetimes in this room, as opposed to already having that be present. There's a thing that happens where penetration of connected techniques like that and opportunities to connect, and for every one of these the same. It's probably true if you went back and measured smoke signals. It kind of tips along at a penetration level that edges up very slowly until it gets to 15%. And I cannot tell you, I don't know that anyone could, why that happens to be the number. But it's the same number with the radio, it is with the television, it is with the fax machine, as it is with emails. And at 15%, it turns and goes like that. And if you are old enough to remember when email wasn't so prevalent, or when fax machines came into existence, there's this time, or if it was back when, this did happen before my time, but, radio, there was a time before which it didn't matter if you had one because nobody else had one. And then suddenly, if you didn't have one, you felt like the only one who didn't have one. And if you have an email, you don't need it because nobody has it. And then all of a sudden, if I don't have email, I can't talk to anybody. That's the knee of the curve. I don't know if that's the 15% that will apply to mindfulness techniques or invitations to headspace or teachings and trainings that go on, but we're in search of that tipping point, and I have faith that whenever we find it, whether it's caused by this convergence of neuroscience and fMRI technologies and awareness of the brain and its activities and functions, or whether it's experiential, it's a big thing.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, as we were talking about a little earlier, all of this stuff is sort of percolating along, and at some point, it's going to take off. And, I think this will be the issue about, if you will, compassion, or being aware, or responding to others, or recognizing that, if you will, we're all in this together, and how can we make the most of that. I think we're going to actually end here and ask for questions from the audience. I know Scott very much likes to have that dialogue. So let's just open it up. Are there any questions?
Scott, thank you for the invitation to come dance with you. I thought I might take it up. I've been an engineer and business person in the electronics industry, and I invited maybe 1,000 of my engineer friends and 100 of my dance friends. Guess who showed up? Right here, there are at least 5 dancers who are dancing. They showed up, and I can count maybe one in the engineering field. And that's been my talent. I love both. I love being in the electronics industry. I love being at CCARE and all that. How should I take this message of presence and authentic leadership back to my engineering friends? Even in the business school, same thing. Stanford Business School, not many people showed up. And it's not to say that it's negative, but it's the tipping point that I'm looking for. How do we bring this awareness and show its value, even from an ROI perspective, to these people?
It's a question with no easy answer. The one thing that we can control that I think will have the most influence is how we show up and whether we're really demonstrating the thing that we're inviting people to. This isn't to say that you aren't, by the way. I don't have any comment on that point. But to the degree that you and all of us can represent the quality of engagement that we want to cultivate, my belief is people will want to be around that. And some may even ask what seems different about this than it does with the rest of my engineering friends or whatever. And in a way, what we're trying to do structurally is create more opportunities to extend those invitations. There's kind of a paradox in this notion of authenticity, though, because as soon as I cross over to telling somebody something that I want them to believe, I kind of violated the premise. And if I can show up and share what I believe and it's kind of one thing. Anyway, that's the thing I think we can do. What I was going to say is that this Gandhi kind of be the change that you want to see in the world stuff is kind of, I don't want to let it devolve to that cliche, but I think that we, if you think about it, why is it that Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and all this stuff is so popular? Is it because of the brilliance of the designers of the invitation? And I don't mean to take anything away from those guys. They are brilliant. But how does it turn into something a billion people do? Because people want to connect. We're not trying to make something happen that's unnatural or that people, if given the opportunity, people want to dance. So I think we just each search for the tipping points in our own. If you've got 5 people that want to in that dance, then it's not linear. So I don't have any magic and I don't pretend any simplification, but that's, I think you're here and I really appreciate it. And I think that's really cool. And then that'll matter.
It's interesting how you mentioned Facebook, though, because you see this incredible desire to have this connection, but are those real connections? And I think that's one of the challenges is having 1,000 Facebook friends, which some people aspire to, doesn't mean you have 1,000 friends.
Yeah, it's not clear that the medium delivers what you want, but it's clear that people want it. Same thing is true about reality TV, in my opinion. It's a bizarre thing. But why do so many people want to watch it? Because it's real, because it's not fake. Now, is it fake, and do they find some pretty bizarre cases to make into reality TV? Absolutely. And does it get, distorted beyond belief? It does. But people want reality and they want connection. And I think if we can offer it, just by making that an offer one at a time, it makes a big difference.
That's
a suggestion for you when you want to reach a larger audience. The people who are responders, whether that's the Red Crescent, the Red Cross, whether it's diplomats, humanitarian aid groups, they themselves burn out at such a rapid rate that they need to be taken care of, and those skills that they learn to take care of themselves need to be passed on. So there was some initial interest not long ago with the Red Crescent. It's overwhelmed right now to look at the possibility of training the responders. So that world, we have health, that's a captive group. We have schools, that's another captive group, but refugee camps are a hugely captive group, and displaced persons. And that whole world of, I could see a program out of Al Jazeera with no problem, similar to what you're doing with this Mind Up. Is that what it is? So I'm just asking you to think in those terms, because you've got a convent, and those are the responders, you've got institutional and historic backing, and you can preempt and step into the vacuum that is filled by less positive interpretations of events?
Well, it's such a great point, and there's a guy named Mark Williams, one of the people we support out of Colorado, who does exactly this work in a mindful way, and we're trying to help him figure out how to reach more people. And he's ex-military, and he's working in PTSD cases, and it's just such a huge thing. So it's a point so well taken, and it's such a desperate need. And sometimes, you know, the greatest opportunities are in places of desperation. You know, there's a complacency around feeling like you're kind of on top of things that's hard to break through. And what we try and think about is how do you it's in a way it's not different than technology marketing and sort of the adoption curve. You know, one of the things that is most difficult to do, but it actually unfortunately is really important, is we believe we have to spend our resources and energy on people that are closest to the need, as opposed to the skeptics and the people on the back end and the trailing edge. And in a technology market, one of the things to make sure you do really carefully is you pick a market and you focus on that and you just ignore the other ones. In this case, trying to figure out how to help and who to help, unfortunately, you actually have to ignore entire cross sections of people. Because if you try and make things work everywhere for everyone all the time, you end up having no impact. So it's a terrible condition when you make it people instead of money and products. But the need to be focused and reach the most reachable people is actually necessary to make useful impact. And some of the people you're talking about are the most desperately in need of help and support. Hospice care workers that live through that loss over and over again. So anyway, it's such a fabulous point. Thank you.
My name is Raquel. I'm a former student from California State University as well.
Hi, Raquel.
My question is that I know a lot of people who are compassionate. Actually, sometimes, and I know a lot of them, that they meet these people that take advantage of that. Mm-hmm. So what would you say to these compassionate people? Because sometimes they feel like, oh, I don't know if I'm doing it right. Like, they have this compassion, but at some point, in some level, they will say, like, I don't know if this is right. I probably don't want to be this person anymore because they're practicing that compassion. What do you tell these people?
To me, it's the reason, one of the most important reasons why community is so powerful. To need the support of a community of people that you can count on. In other words, I think being able to have trusted relationships so that if it feels, you can usually tell if something doesn't feel right. Sometimes we're afraid to act on it, sometimes we don't get supported, sometimes we get encouraged to do the wrong things. And if I can turn to trusted relationships that I know I can rely on with people that I know care about me and that are out to help me be the best, then I'd lean on those. Because it's hard to, this thing about letting go of outcomes, in my experience, is actually one of those many things that are easy to say and hard to do. And usually being taken advantage of means that I'm not willing to let go of the outcome of how this person's going to think or feel, and so I'm going to subordinate my own self because of what this person wants, even if I know it doesn't feel quite right. And really having in part it's courage, which is another easy thing to say and a hard thing to do. And so how do I get that? Is by relying on the trusted relationships and by cultivating those. By going to my brother or sister or mother or father or best friend and saying, I need you. I really need you. That's another thing I think people embrace. And if you have those relationships, then spend time developing and valuing and appreciating those. And then those relationships help us not stumble into the ones that otherwise left alone we might talk ourselves into. So, again, easy things to say, but it's all I know.
I think also you have to be careful because, the Dalai Lama has even commented on this, and a lot of people, put him up as an icon of compassion, if you will. But, compassion doesn't mean everybody walks all over you and you just say, submit. When people take advantage of you, and getting back to this, if it feels wrong, it's wrong. And it doesn't make you less by saying, no, this is unacceptable. I think you have to be careful about this. I think this was our next question.
Yeah, I have a question. Is your 1440 program here in Silicon Valley, and do you want volunteers or need volunteers? And if so, how do we get in contact with you?
Yes, and it's just Scott at 1440.
But don't tell anybody that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to have that conversation, because we're trying to figure out ways to do exactly that, invite people to be part of it. Really, we ourselves have things we were trying to do, but there are so many champions that we try and serve that could use help and support and any bit of time. And a lot of them are around the valley, and the kind of talent and energy that we have as volunteers to help them in some way is fantastic. So 1440.com? .org. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Scott, you had talked about how people want to come to the U.S. from all over the world for various reasons. And my wife and I were actually originally from Nepal. And so I recently got back, and I was able to actually meet Matthew Ricard. So a lot of the people there, they want help. So a lot of my friends who run schools. So what I told them was, and they want the U.S. connection to help their students come to the U.S. So what I had told them was, because I know Matthew is really involved with compassion in education, and I know Stanford is also, that they should develop that concept or experiment with it in Nepal. And maybe when they talk to American counterparts, they have something to share. So is your organization interested in anything like this?
We are, so far, because we're early into this, the stuff that we're directly involved with is all in the North American continent, not out of lack of care or concern, just inability to get that far and make an impact. However, there's a group that is involved in the social emotional learning dimension called CASEL, C-A-S-E-L. It's a collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning, and it's casel.org. It's like a kind of a clearinghouse of practitioners, many of whom are international. And so if you go to CASEL, they can give you a list of all the qualified SEL practitioners and programs that they know of, at least, that are recorded and registered with them. And they've been at this for a long time. They've gotten great support from the Buffett family. Peter and Jennifer Buffett are huge supporters of CASEL, and it's making a big push to make a big difference. And they've got incredible passion and reach around the world. So they can be the best resource I can name for CASEL. Yeah, casel.org. Sure, thank you.
Next question, yes, sir.
In the effort to develop trust and authentic relationships, it seems that fear is a big obstacle to being vulnerable, and safety is important. And fear often stems from not questioning one's beliefs and thoughts that can be fearful. Have you done any work or have any interest in pursuing our own relationships with our own thoughts?
This is a really important thing to me, because one of the reasons that most of my life was below the line, maybe it still is, I haven't really done the exercise lately, but it certainly was because I was afraid. And most of the things I did for double negative reasons, because even when we were walking with Joanie 16 or 18 years ago, whatever it was, when I decided that it was time to try being a CEO, and I did it because I didn't want to not have done it. It was a weird reason. Because I was afraid. And so anyway, I think this fear is incredibly powerful, and when it's fear we carry within ourselves, it's so dominant because it knows what we are afraid of most, and it goes right to that place and imposes the fear that the worst thing you can imagine is what's going to happen if you don't listen to me. One of the great things I find with a contemplative practice is being able to be aware of awareness, being able to be aware that that's in there and that that's going on. And my definition of courage includes no conquest of fear. My definition of courage is being afraid and doing it anyway. And just allowing fear to exist along with the rest of what exists instead of being the only thing that exists. And what fear would like to do, in my opinion, is predominate our consciousness. The only thing that you should be thinking about is me. And this fear of that thing is all that matters, and the worst thing in the world will be if that happens. And in a contemplative practice, my experience has been that I can hear that, but I can hear other stuff too. And so it's there, and it's scary, and it's not going to be easy to ignore, but it's not the only voice. And I think starting inside to do that is really, it's the toughest and the most important work. And just being able to listen is the best I know to let it be there.
Yeah, it's interesting because this issue of, in some ways, getting back to the neuroscience, your amygdala gets hijacked. When we were on the savannah, it was wonderful because it saved our lives, and you had this immense release of epinephrine and norepinephrine and cortisol, et cetera, and allowed you to survive or not. But in our modern society, with all this stuff that's coming in, we were really never designed for that at this point, and this is where these fear responses get out of hand, and you get this imbalance between your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. And there's an immense amount of evidence related to these types of mental training practices or meditation practices that allow you to deal with that fear and, in fact, if you will, reset the thermostat of how your autonomic nervous system is functioning. And again, we're just seeing this huge outpouring of science about this. And it allows, I think, people to be aware, but be able to function and go on with their lives, and then just let it be, but not have the same response to it.
That's the other way I would have explained it if we had time.
Yeah, just taking a lead on this fear topic. Some of us are looking at the banking system as basically trafficking in fear, especially credit scoring as a quantification number that identifies you and then triggers all those responses. And I just wanted to share another scaling opportunity, I think, for you all, which is we're looking at the reversal or the antithesis of that, which is quantifying altruism and letting people succeed in that area. And I shared that recently with one of the major credit scoring companies, gurus, and he was just dumbfounded. He sat there for a couple of minutes thinking that he had been quantifying fear all this time. And he didn't realize it. Honestly, he didn't. So,
but unfortunately, there's some very smart people who actually know how to manipulate fear, right? And that's one of the issues we have in our society.
And fear of money is a big one to capitalize on.
Yes, young lady.
Yeah, hi. I'm Neelam, and I'm a new migrant to the Silicon Valley. I moved from UK and I'm from India originally. I'm a philosopher by training. I've worked as a business journalist and many other things. My question to you is, I've been a Reiki healer for the last 10 years, which is an energy healing, and I've had fantastic results with that personally and for my friends and family. However, I have never been able to charge, as I was explaining to him, anyone for my practice. And here I am trying to reinvent myself for some sort of a work which brings together my intellectual training in philosophy, my exposure to the business world, and my magic which I can do with my hands. My question to you is, are companies like yours willing to give this an institutional structure, or does it have to be a cottage industry? Or in traditional societies, the monks used to be supported by the mainstream society, and what role do people like us have in corporate America or anywhere in this world right now, where as he says, altruism can be measured? Unfortunately, it is not. I have not seen a job description where any of these things were specified as job descriptors. We just have, I'm a writer, okay, so I go and apply for writing, and all I get are marketing jobs. And I'm a journalist, I'm a truth seeker. I cannot write that marketing sphere. So my question to you is it possible for companies like you to build an institutional structure, create job descriptors where people with certain skill sets, I'm an experimenter, I experiment with some frequency healing, this, that, all my life, but I don't want to be a cottage industry. I want to belong to an institution, to have a community. And is your program Headspace.com? Is this sort of a company that I'm thinking what it is? To develop products in this space, mindfulness, meditation, altruism?
The Headspace guys are really fascinating because there's a monk who does the teachings, and then his partner is an ad and marketing professional by training who began a practice some years ago and decided it was more important to try and promote that. And so they've built these incredibly clever campaigns to brand affiliate.
I was thinking of the airline thing all the time. I have some friends who fly, and all the time they're away sleeping or doing some work. I thought there has to be something where they just plug in and just. So I was experimenting with this frequency healing thing, some products that probably you just can plug in and just dissolve.
This is a simplistic answer to a complex question. But the thing that I've seen champions, in our vernacular, the way you're a champion. And so how can we serve a champion who has passion and wants to make impact? The biggest challenge that champions that we've experienced have is overreaching the possible to the desirable. And trying to start by wanting to have the kind of impact that you want to have is the source of passion. It's difficult to make that into the practical path unless you can dial it way back and start smaller. And it sounds like a discouraging thing to say, and I don't mean it that way at all. But the concept of dana and support for care and concern is not so foreign as to be impossible, and a number of the champions that we serve operate on the basis of people donating as they are able to, based on the experience that they have, and building a community. In the corporate world, some of this is true at Juniper, frankly not as much as I wish was. It's more visible in some other companies. Wellness practices and the notion of wellness and its impact on being able to reduce insurance costs by not being unwell in the first place and giving employees the opportunity to experiment with how they do that. There's some institutional opportunity in that, but boy, from an individual standpoint, that's a big reach. So my practical, hopefully not discouraging advice is it's concentric circles and build close to home.
I can think of, certainly Google has had a practice of openness to different types of practices, as has Zynga, actually, although they're having their own issues right now. But But there are sort of places where these things are happening or people are happening. It is extraordinary. I mean, Scott mentioned the cost of healthcare. You know, we're going to be doing a conference soon here on the 30th of April on compassion in business. And in fact, Scott's blog for Huffington Post related to that just came out today. And then there's another one or two that I've done in the recent past. But really this issue of the impact, if you will, of fear and anxiety in the workplace, because that's where this comes from, leads to this enormous cost in terms of mind-body disconnects, headache, absenteeism, something we call presenteeism, where you're at work but you're not functioning. I see, obviously, many of you know that. But it's a huge cost to corporate America. I mean, can you imagine? The estimates are $200 to $300 billion a year are lost because of that. And you're talking about $5,000 to $7,500 per employee. I mean, it's a huge, huge cost. And the science is there that demonstrate with these types of practices that Scott's been alluding to and myself, they can have a huge, huge impact. And the reality is, you know, you talk about desperate situations, people are willing to try anything. And in fact, unfortunately, in some ways, the way mindfulness has got into schools initially is because they were in desperate situations. They'll say, look, if you're going to come and do something, we'll take it. And we're seeing, though, the profound results in there, but that can have a result, of course, in any school. Because, you know, violence, bullying, disconnects are not associated necessarily with just poverty. You know, in very affluent areas, many of these same issues exist, and in fact, on some level, more so. I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, but we'll be down here for a few minutes. I want to thank you all so much for coming. Scott, thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you all for being here.